It's so wonderful to see a full audience again, and some people are still coming in. You know, we're all emerging out of COVID. I have a mask with me that I'm going to put on if anyone starts to cough. I hope not. But it's terrific to see everyone here. I am Michelle Kidwell Gilbert, Chair of the Archaeology Committee of the National Arts Club, and good evening. Bravo. I thank you. For those of you who are not familiar with the club, it was founded in 1898. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based in Gramercy Park with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs, including exhibitions, theatrical, and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the Arts Club, kindly visit us at thenationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Now, there's something I don't have to mention, but I would. The Arts Club, and this deserves another bravo, was the first club in New York to have women admitted equally with men. And that's a real bravo since someone said bravo. Okay? On behalf of the President, Board of Governors, and Archaeology Committee, I am particularly delighted that the Biennial Lecture on Harvard's Excavations at Sardis is being given at the National Arts Club, rather than as customary at the Harvard Club. For those fortunate to be in attendance tonight, you may be interested to learn that at some point it was no longer possible to register for tonight's program. All present, thus, are part of a highly select group, and a particular welcome. Permit me to speak briefly about Turkey and enumerate its shared history. During the Neolithic period, this area became associated with early modes of agriculture, the seminal migration of peoples into Europe, as well as humanity's first yet discovered historic religious site. Names often utilized are Anatolia and Asia Minor, two land masses which do not overlap perfectly. Do realize additionally that our discrete 2023 borders are not the identical geographic demarcations utilized during antiquity. The Archaeology Committee has presented diverse programs about this fascinating terrain, which I will summarize for context in a quasi-chronological order. Greeks, and there were other groups as well, colonized the area, establishing their own towns while enriching others. Amongst the prominent non-Hellenic sites which have been discussed was Gordian, whose earliest remains date to approximately 2500 BCE, or the early Bronze Age. Herodotus relates that its renowned ruler Midas became the first foreigner to undertake an offering at Delphi's sanctuary of Apollo. A periodically treated location is Numinous Aphrodisias, dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite. Although having a broadly similar origin date as Gordian, attested to in a lecture on prehistoric Aphrodisias by the late, great Martha Sharp-Jurowski, Aphrodisias rose to significance as a city-state in the Hellenistic period, subsequently garnering personal attention and protection of Octavian. The club's lecture about Troy highlighted the clash of cultures between the indigenous Anatolian inhabitants and Achaeans or Greeks. Ephesus was founded in the 4th century by one of Alexander the Great's generals. In 133, with Asia Minor now incorporated into the Roman Empire, it was designated capital of the province. Lastly, two interrelated talks featured the initial settlement of what would become known as Constantinople, followed by a photographic survey of Istanbul's monuments. Professor of Greek and Roman art and archaeology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Nicholas D. Cahill received his bachelor's degree at the University of Michigan and both master's and doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley. At Berkeley, he studied under Crawford H. Greenwald, Jr., known as Greenie, who for 36 years directed the Sardis excavations. And I want to tell you, Nick, I was on the Archaeological Institute of America's Gala Committee when Greenie received the Biennial Award for Public Service to Archaeology on April 25th, 2012, as a testament for how important Sardis is as a site and the importance of your lecture as well, for which we sincerely thank you. Since 1979, a member of the archaeological explorations of Sardis, situated in Western Anatolia, Dr. Cahill has served beginning in 2008 as its director, keeping alive Greenie's traditions and standard of excellence. With a voluminous history of publications, Professor Cahill also has conducted fieldwork in England, Israel, and Greece. It gives me great pleasure now in welcoming Dr. Cahill to the podium. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to speak to you at this amazing mansion. And I'm very grateful to Michelle Kidwell-Gilbert for her kind invitation and her kind introduction, to Nadine Heiniger and the staff at the National Arts Club for their support and for this wonderful room. And again, I should explain that this is an ongoing series of biennial lectures on recent work at Sardis, established more than 50 years ago by the first expedition director, Professor George Hanfmann of Harvard. So I'll try to give a little bit of background to the site and its history, and then talk about more specifically about our work in the last couple of years. Sardis was one of the great cities of the ancient world, the home of kings like Gyges and Croesus, the motherland of the Etruscans in Italy, according to some sources, and one of the 7 churches of Asia. It's located in western Turkey, about an hour's drive in from Izmir, in the foothills of the Tmolus Mountains. It's, as you can see, a site of great natural beauty, with the cliffs of the Acropolis gleaming golden in the morning light or the afternoon light, rising above the fertile green plains. In antiquity, it was prized for its many natural resources, its fertility, its forests, and other natural resources in the mountains, and for its impregnable citadel. And the Pactolus River burbled by the site, and above all else brought Sardis fame because it ran rich with alluvial gold, making the inhabitants, the Lydians, the wealthiest people in the world, and the inventors of the first coins. The gold ran out, but Sardis's fame as the golden city was never lost. Let me just give a brief history focusing on some of the particular problems that occupied our research. First, who were the Lydians? In about 668 BC, Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, the most powerful man in the world, received an embassy at his capital at Nineveh in what's now Iraq. The stranger spoke a language nobody could comprehend, but explained that he came from someplace over there called Lydia, and that they were threatened by nomadic horsemen from Central Asia called Cimmerians. The Lydian king Gyges offered submission to the Assyrians if they would help repel the invaders. In the end, the diplomacy led nowhere. The Assyrians sent no aid. The Cimmerians swept through the land, and Gyges was killed. At just about this same time, one of the earliest Greek poets, Archilochus, boasted that he did not care for the wealth of Gyges, rich in gold. And this is a common conceit among the Greeks, who claim to be above mere lucre and to value friendship over coin. But Gyges dedicated at the Greek sanctuary at Delphi 6 mixing bowls weighing something like 780 kilograms of gold. So these two earliest literary sources indicate the position of Gyges between East and West. On the one hand, they were a distant people from the Assyrians, beyond the Western limits of civilization, speaking an incomprehensible language, not worth sending an army all the way to defend. To the Greeks, on the other hand, the Lydians were prototypical Oriental monarchs, living in unimaginable luxury, famous for their delicately woven headbands, their exotic foods, their perfumes, their extraordinary generosity, and an unstoppable cavalry. The Lydians also stand at the border between history and prehistory. Gyges in the 7th century BC is the first historical Lydian we know of. The Greek geographer Strabo even tells us that Sardis did not exist until after the Trojan War, about 1200 BC, relatively late in the long history of Anatolia, although, as we'll see, Strabo was wrong. For the period between 1200 and 680 BC, then, we have only these fabulous stories about the Heraclid dynasty, like how Queen Omphale enslaved Heracles and made him wear women's clothes while she wore his lion skin and club. This wonderful reversal of gender roles encapsulating the Greeks' attitudes towards the Lydians as, on the one hand, effeminate, and on the other hand, powerful enough to overcome the greatest of Greek heroes. But it's not history. Herodotus and other historians tell us that Gyges founded a dynasty that ruled Sardis for 5 generations, and under this series of kings, Sardis came to rule all of western Turkey, conquering the Greeks along the coast, the Phrygians in central Anatolia, and everybody in between. They became players in international politics. Gyges sent troops to Egypt to help their revolt against the Assyrians. They drove the Cimmerians from Asia. They established political and dynastic ties with Greeks and Iranians. They became, as I said, great patrons of Greek sanctuaries, including the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, later one of the 7 wonders of the world, whose columns were dedicated by Croesus, the last king of Sardis. And Croesus also dedicated something like 8 tons of gold at Delphi. And because it will be relevant later, I'll mention that we know, or we thought we knew, the exact dates of this last king. He was overthrown in about 547 BC, and Herodotus tells us that he ruled for 14 years. So he must have come to the throne in 561, and that becomes this sort of fixed date in archaic Greek chronology. Sardis was famous as golden because the Pactolus River, as I said, flowing by the ancient city, ran rich with natural gold. And legend had it that King Midas of Phrygia, when he realized that the golden touch was not all it was cracked up to be, came to Sardis to wash away that golden curse. And from that time on, the gold panned from the Pactolus made the Lydians these richest people in the world. This is connected in some way with the Lydians inventing the first coinage in the world, probably during the reign of Gyges between 680 and 644 BC. This technology changed the world forever, but like so much else at Sardis, it's not quite as simple as taking gold from the Pactolus and making coins out of it. The earliest coins were struck in electrum, about 54% gold and 46% silver, and in many different sizes, from a full stater of 14 grams to tiny coins of even 192nd of a stater, weighing 0.07 grams, a quarter of a small aspirin tablet. People have assumed since the 19th century that the electrum was the natural gold ore from the Pactolus River. But just a few years ago, we discovered that the gold in the Pactolus River was not, in fact, mixed with silver, but was almost entirely pure. Instead, it seems that the gold comes from mines in northwestern Anatolia, which the Lydians conquered in the 7th century BC as they expanded their empire. So coinage is thus a product, I think, of Lydian imperialism, the result of having a strong political and military power in charge of these rich mines of valuable but unpredictable ore. In the 6th century BC, the Lydians changed their coinage from electrum to a bimetallic system of pure gold and pure silver, with a lion and bull on the front. This was a profound transformation, mostly because the earlier electrum coins were apparently overvalued in relationship to the metal in them, sort of a token currency, like, our quarters or something. So they were only used within the empire where the Lydian kings could guarantee their value. The pure gold and silver coins, on the other hand, were worth exactly as much as the metal in them, and so could be used for international trade outside the region of Lydian control. These coins were known as Cresids, and the invention attributed to the last king, Croesus, as rich as Croesus, and the patron of so many Greek sanctuaries. We have some new Cresids from our excavation, so I wanted to mention that now. With all this gold and power, the Lydian kings monumentalized their city, constructing immense terraces in the city's center, and encircled it with fortifications 20 meters, 65 feet thick, and 3.5 kilometers long. The masonry of the terraces is similar to Greek masonry of the time, like at the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, but the mud brick wall, on the other hand, is entirely based on Near Eastern prototypes, so the Lydians were drawing on architectural traditions from both West and East. Across the valley from Sardis was an elite cemetery of monumental tumulus tombs, mounds with chambers in them, as you see here, called Bintepe, not 1,000 mounds as is in Turkish, but more than something like 120 something. The largest of these is the tumulus of Aliates, which is described by Herodotus as the greatest structure ever built, and it's 360 meters in diameter, more than half as big in diameter as the Great Pyramid of Giza, and this crudely overlaid image of the Great Pyramid gives a sense of scale that Herodotus is describing. The pyramid is twice as tall and is built of stone, of course, but the mound is still a pretty big pile of dirt. And anyway. Perhaps the most famous event of Lydian history is the end of the empire. In about 550 BC, a new king, Cyrus, was on the rise in Persia. Croesus, the king of Lydia, hoped to add to his territory, so he asked the oracle at Delphi whether he should attack Cyrus. The oracle then famously and ambiguously replied that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. So Croesus set out, but was then defeated by the Persian king, and his city captured and burned. So he fulfilled the oracle by destroying his own empire. We've uncovered dramatic remains of the sack of Sardis, houses burned, soldiers slaughtered and left in the rubble, the fortification deliberately demolished. These destructive events are wonderful for archaeologists since they preserve for us so many artifacts, and we get a detailed look at the lives of ordinary people interrupted so suddenly that we find cooking pots on hearths still filled with grain, or, for instance, this soldier who wore a heavy iron helmet so long that it compressed the vertebrae of his neck. He was found with a tiny 24th stater near his head. So what happened next when the Lydians were no longer masters of their own empire, but part of a larger one? People had always assumed that Sardis continued pretty much as it did before, but under new management, that the Persians moved into the palace of Croesus and ruled from there. But the archaeological record reveals a different story. It turns out that the city center was entirely abandoned, and here, for instance, you see a Lydian house on the right, in here, destroyed in 550 BC. And the next thing that happens on this spot happened more than 350 years later when the Hellenistic theater in green was built. In those 3 and more intervening centuries, this was a regional capital with a powerful governor and a strong garrison, but the ancient city lay fallow. Although no historical source documents this, we've seen this pattern over and over in archaeology, and I have to believe it. Alexander the Great took Sardis in 334 BC, and the city center was then reoccupied and transformed from a Persian capital to a Greek polis. Monumental buildings, maybe the Hellenistic palace of this western capital of the Seleucid Empire, were built from blocks salvaged from earlier Lydian structures. The greatest monument is the Temple of Artemis, which is the subject of a research project lasting more than 30 years, and Fikret Yegul drew every marble block of the temple at large scale, wrote a detailed account of this magnificent building, and after decades of research, the 2-volume report was finally published in 2020. Sardis joined the Roman Empire in 133 BC, but the really profound change comes a century and a half later. Sardis was located, as I said, in this fertile, defensible spot, but the site has real disadvantages like being located directly on a major fault line. In 17 AD, a devastating earthquake struck the city, but the Sardians then rebuilt their city with the help of the imperial Roman purse. Among these public projects were a stadium, the reconstruction of the theater, an enormous bath gymnasium complex, which you see in the upper right, and a monumental arch at the entrance to the city, which is now just a pile of rubble. And in the center of the city was a sanctuary of the imperial cult, with a huge temple, lavishly decorated with reliefs and freestanding sculpture and ornament, again more later. In late antiquity, the temple was dismantled and its remains built into new buildings on the spot. One of lots of cases where the Sardians recycled their own past. And this is one of our other research interests, when the world was undergoing these dramatic changes from the pagan world of imperial Rome to the Christian world of Byzantium. For instance, it flourished in the late Roman period. The city had had a large and important Jewish population, and in the 4th century, they converted part of the Bath Gymnasium complex into a synagogue, one of the largest in the ancient world, paved with colorful mosaics, its walls covered with marble revetment. The synagogue was discovered in 1962, excavated and restored over the next 10 years or so, and half a century later, we've returned to this remarkable building, as we'll see. In the early Byzantine period, the lower city was destroyed, and the inhabitants fled to the Acropolis, hauling blocks from the buildings of the lower city to build these tremendous fortifications. And we've recently begun a new project to understand Sardis in this post-antique period. So with this enormous site, with this wealth of history and monuments, where should archaeologists begin? And I should mention that we're not the first to dig at Sardis. Howard Crosby Butler of Princeton University led an expedition there in 1910 to 1914 and again in 1922. Their focus was on the Temple of Artemis, which they uncovered in 4 heroic years, and on the Lydian cemeteries, to which we'll return in a moment. In 1958, though, the founder of the present expedition, Professor Hanfmann of Harvard, returned to Sardis and took on an amazing range of projects, from excavation for the first time at the Lydian City Center and at Bintepe, to the excavation and restoration of the Bath Gymnasium complex and the synagogue, the first such large-scale restoration project in Turkey. His wide range of interests and long vision are what made the project a success. At such a complicated site, you can't just focus on one thing, but have to take advantage of and sort of enjoy that long time span and range of the site. When Professor Hanfmann retired in 1976, Professor Greenwalt of Berkeley took over and directed the site, as said, for the next 36 years. One thing that drew Butler, Hanfmann, and Greenwalt to the site, though, were the Lydians, for while there's lots of important Hellenistic and Roman sites, Sardis is the only Lydian city, the capital of these people who invented coinage and ruled Anatolia and bridged east and west. I don't want to diminish the importance of those later phases, but Hanfmann had his eyes on Lydian Sardis. Unfortunately, he was unwittingly laboring under a misapprehension. He followed Herodotus' description of the city in 499, which was a ragtag scatter of houses along the Pactolus River. So that's where Hanfmann dug. He didn't know about that historically undocumented depopulation of the urban core, or realized that Persian Sardis in 499 BC was a completely different settlement from imperial capital under Croesus 50 years earlier. But he concluded that the Lydian city was also this dispersed settlement along the Pactolus, with excavation at various sectors there, and I should mention that the final publication of 2 of these sectors was just finished in 2021. It fell to the next director, Professor Greenwalt, to discover that colossal city wall, 20 meters wide, so large that Professor Hanfmann had excavated for 30 years across the street from it without realizing that it was not just a natural hill. Greenie then proved that it was not the east wall of a city along the Pactolus, but rather the west wall of a city located along north of the Acropolis, under the Hellenistic and Roman cities, and that the sectors that Professor Hanfmann had been digging for a generation were outside the Lydian city. So our main focus of excavation in recent years has been the city center, the core of the city in the Lydian and Hellenistic and Roman times. And let me start with an artificial terrace almost exactly in the middle of the ancient city, which we call Field 55. Today it's just an olive orchard, but in the early Roman period, this was the sanctuary of an imperial cult dating to the middle of the 1st century AD in the Julio-Claudian era, and part of a much larger complex that included the stadium and theater. The temple was a lavish structure with sculpted figural column capitals, a figural frieze, maybe pedimental sculptures. We found Corinthian capitals from the temple decorated with human and animal figures, blocks of the architrave with an inscription in gilded bronze letters, now missing unfortunately, and hundreds of architectural blocks and fragments of sculpture and inscriptions from the sanctuary, giving us a really remarkable picture of this expensive temple and the dedications of prominent Sardian citizens and groups. It seems that this was a neocorate temple, that is, one that was dedicated and built not by the city of Sardis, but by the whole province of Asia. And these were a great honor. Cities of the Roman Empire competed for the privilege of owning such a temple. And so this would have been a jewel in Sardis's crown. Almost nothing survives in situ, though. The temple, one of Sardis's most important sanctuaries, was completely dismantled in the 4th century AD, and its fragments reused in late Roman constructions on the east side of the terrace. And so that's where our work has been recently. There's a huge wall built almost entirely out of inscribed statue bases and architectural blocks, maybe a late Roman fortification. On top of the terrace, they converted the sanctuary to luxurious houses, and in previous lectures I've reported on some of the remarkable finds from the southern house, collections of iron swords and bronze weights, pottery and glass and other artifacts, rooms with beautifully painted walls, a sort of a late Roman Pompeii. Our work over the last 2 years has focused on the house to the north, and in particular on a large marble-paved courtyard that must have been the focus of that house. Here, though, we find no artifacts on the floors. The house seems to have been abandoned before it was destroyed. The rooms were still standing, though. We've got columns from the central colonnade toppled into the middle of the court, and as so often in late Roman houses, the columns were built from recycled pieces, with one Ionic and one Corinthian capital, for instance, in this wonderful eclectic diversity. The walls were painted to look like brightly colored marble revetment, very like the rooms to the south. And we've got the marble pavement of the court very well preserved. In the middle are these circular designs carved into the pavement, which are identified as gaming boards. They're found carved into pavements all over the streets and buildings of the Roman Empire. Excavation in 2021 and 2022 revealed the northern and western parts of the court, which were very badly plundered for reasons that I'll come back to, and also got important deposits from under the courtyard floor, which suggest that the house was constructed in the second half of the 4th century, satisfyingly close to the destruction of the temple. That period between sort of 360 and 400 AD saw remarkable transformations of the whole city, not just the demolition of one of the city's most important pagan temples, but also the construction of the synagogue, Church EA outside the city, and a small church in the Temple of Artemis. So a major transformation of the city's religious life throughout the whole town. You will have noticed, I think, cracks sort of thereabouts, in the earth and walls and revetments running from one side of the court to the other, and also the way the columns and walls all collapse to the east. And that's the remains of a tremendous earthquake that shattered the house, bringing down the roof, toppling the columns of the portico, and splitting the earth beneath to some unknown depth. And I want to stop just for a moment to acknowledge and grieve the terrible loss of life, the families torn apart, the horrific destruction brought by the devastating earthquakes in southeast Turkey on February 6, 2023, and the aftershocks that continue to bring havoc to the region. Our hearts go out to all of those affected and to everyone in Turkey as the whole country and the world sends aid and support to the region. Those kinds of current events make our archaeological work seem sort of insignificant and irrelevant, but maybe we can learn something about ancient earthquakes from Sardis. We've seen how this sector is framed then by two disastrous earthquakes. The sanctuary of the imperial cult was built after the earthquake of 17 AD, when Sardis and 11 other cities were destroyed. But Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, quickly stepped in and offered relief, and the Sardians rebuilt their city. They constructed, as I said, a new imperial bath gymnasium complex at the edge of the city. They added a stadium to the theater. They repaired the Temple of Artemis and probably dedicated at this point its eastern half to the imperial cult. And they gave over the whole city center to this enormous Neocorate sanctuary of the imperial cult with a lavish temple and plaza. The work took a couple of generations, but it left Sardis a great metropolis. In return for the help given by the Roman state, the Sardians renamed their city the Caesarian Sardians. They named a tribe of their city Caesares, and they dedicated in Rome a huge statue of the emperor surrounded by personifications of the 12 cities whom he had aided. A statue base derived from this lost monument was found in Puteoli in the 19th century and is now in the Naples Archaeological Museum. In the aftermath of this earthquake, then, Sardis was completely rebuilt, establishing a new urban landscape that would last for 600 years. And from an archaeologist's point of view, nearly every trace of the earthquake was erased. We find no piles of rubble because the city was cleaned up and rebuilt. The earthquake 600 years later, however, is a completely different story. We found traces of this quake through the city. The Temple of Artemis collapsed, as did houses that occupied the sanctuary of the imperial cult, and the Bath Gymnasium, the synagogue, an enormous arch, the Byzantine shops. And this time, there was no reconstruction. The ruins were left where they fell. Sardis and much of the Roman world had been weakened by drought and disease and incompetent rulers and a host of other problems, and rather than rebuild as they had in the time of Tiberius, they left the ruins in place and simply moved elsewhere. Here in Field 55, the earthquake destroyed that fortification wall, split the terrace to a depth of more than 8 meters below modern ground level. The house we're digging now was abandoned, so we don't find a lot of artifacts, but beneath the rubble elsewhere, we found those wonderful artifacts, as I mentioned earlier, and also parts of at least 4 victims of the earthquake, 3 adults and a child, identified by Professor Yilmaz Erdal of Hacettepe University. The earthquake is dated by coins to the early 7th century AD, the latest coin of 612 or so and others of 616 or thereabouts. We are still trying to determine whether there was one earthquake or more than one. It could have been a series of catastrophes. And many other cities in western Turkey were destroyed at just this time, including Laodicea, Hierapolis, Aphrodisias, possibly Ephesus, possibly Miletus, and others. Like at Sardis, archaeologists find collapsed buildings, seismic faults splitting the ground, and other traces of an earthquake in the early 7th century. So this was not a local, but was a regional disaster, and the recent events make it easier to visualize the plight of the victims who were much less prepared for this catastrophe. And as at Sardis, there was no rebuilding afterwards. The remains were mostly not cleaned up, and the character of urban life in Western Asia changed forever. One puzzling thing about this earthquake, though, is that it doesn't seem to be attested in any ancient source. There have been lots of studies and lists of ancient earthquakes, and people have combed through those records pretty thoroughly, and yet I at least have not been able to find this one mentioned in literary sources. The archaeological record is really clear and can't be doubted. I have no explanation, though, for lack of contemporary mentions, and I'd be grateful for any ideas. We've been working with geophysicists Mahmut Drahor and Ukmen Sumer of 9th of September University, who've been working on this very problem of the ancient earthquakes at Sardis. And over the past 2 summers, they've used geophysical techniques like electrical resistance tomography to measure a series of deep sections through the site, and by them plotted that main fault extending deep into the earth. The little cracks that we find in excavations seem really impressive to us, but they're just surface fissures, of course. They've identified that fault, and we're beginning to appreciate how more fully how its geology and seismicity affected the basic structure of urban Sardis. They are now working in the southeast Turkey on that fault system, but we hope that they'll be able to join us this summer. This was not the end of life at Sardis, though. We saw how the earthquake debris and fallen columns and masonry were preserved in the center of the court, but around the edges, we don't find that fallen masonry, and we don't even have a pavement anymore. Survivors apparently dug through all of that in order to extract the marble blocks from the floor and basins and other features around the edges of the court. And this is important new evidence for occupation at Sardis during a very little-known early Byzantine period after the earthquake had left most of the city in ruins. Excuse me. Those salvagers left behind a number of interesting artifacts: a lead seal, a silver-plated bronze buckle, and 2 Byzantine lead amulets. These show on one side a face within a circle surrounded by a cross with 8 snakes' heads radiating from the circle. And similar amulets bear an inscription which identifies the motif as a uterus, a womb, and say something like, "Womb, black, blackening, as a snake you coil, as a serpent you hiss, as a lion you roar, as a lamb lie down." The other side shows the Holy Rider, led by a saint and spearing a fallen female demon, who it may be identified as Abidzu or Gailu, and these are barren, childless demons who can harm pregnant women and young children. So such amulets may be intended to protect the wearer from dangers posed by the so-called wandering womb, as it was conceived of in antiquity. Why would people need all that marble after the lower city had been destroyed by an earthquake? After the earthquake, as I said, the focus of occupation moves up to the Acropolis, which was fortified with massive walls, some of the most imposing features of the ancient city. These walls are built almost entirely from spolia from the lower city, including the vast gymnasium complex, the theater, the stadium, the Temple of Artemis, and this area, which was almost completely dismantled and moved to the Acropolis. Those walls have not been intensively studied, however, and a recent survey by Ben Anderson and Jordan Pickett was started in 2019 and continued last summer after a COVID hiatus. One of the things they're doing is they're trying to date the walls with carbon-14 using a relatively new technology there. I want to skip, now you see the Acropolis in the background, and I want to skip from the Byzantine to the Lydian period. Those seismic faults, as I said, created a dramatic landscape of the city site, a series of steps or terraces down from the Acropolis to an intermediate zone about 100 meters above the plain, which we see in the video there, and then down to the lower city. That intermediate zone between the Acropolis and the lower city is one of particular interest and has been the focus of study for something like 40 years. We've been excavating on 2 flat-topped hills called Field 49 on the left and Biz Fort on the right. When we first dug on those hills in the 80s, we thought they were outside the Lydian city and thought that they might be something like an extramural sanctuary or something. Now we know they're in the heart of the Lydian city, and we've been developing the hypothesis that they represent the Lydian palace. One of the most striking features of urbanism, in fact, is the way the Lydians enclosed natural hills with tall terrace walls, restructuring the landscape, regularizing and organizing it, and transforming it into a series of gleaming vertical plains which echoed the sheer undulating cliffs of the Acropolis behind. And this radical transformation of the natural landscape is quite unlike contemporary Greek urbanism. So we've been trying to find out more about these terraces by excavating along the slopes of Field 49. Like everything at Sardis, of course, this is harder than it seems. This was the city center for 1,000 years after the Lydians, and in order to reach Lydian levels, we have to dig through late Roman, early Roman, Hellenistic, all very interesting and important, but not something I want to talk about in this lecture. Moreover, the Lydian architecture here is made of very finely cut limestone and marble blocks, which are so desirable that later builders systematically dig them out to reuse them in their own buildings. So we find just pits where there had been walls. So we were really excited in 2017 when we uncovered a small stretch of beautiful limestone masonry still in situ, the kind found in elite Lydian terraces, and just what the palace should be made of. Just as exciting was a small area of burned floor dated by pottery to the middle of the 6th century BC with 3 arrowheads on it, which might be the remains of that Persian sack of Sardis in 547. And we've, remember, excavated this destruction debris elsewhere at Sardis and found wonderful artifacts and even casualties, soldiers killed in battle and discarded under a thick layer of destruction debris that protected the floors and the assemblages from plundering and erosion. Again, it's sort of like a Lydian Pompeii documenting the last moments of the Lydian city when Croesus destroyed a great empire, his own. One of those soldiers, as I said, had a tiny coin with him. On Field 49, however, we haven't had that kind of luck. We find small pockets of disturbed destruction debris with human bones and elite artifacts, metal vessels and ivory inlays and such. But all of it is disturbed, chewed up by later robbing. On the one hand, these valuable artifacts help identify Field 49 as a fundamentally different and elite zone of the city. And on the other hand, it's obviously kind of disappointing to find the area so badly plundered. So as I said, this hint of a better preserved destruction level here was a strong draw, and Will Bruce was able to spend I forced him to spend a couple years removing a complex series of Hellenistic walls and earth floors. And then, of course, we got the pandemic. But in 2021, we were finally able to expose more of this wall and in front of it that destruction level. There was very little collapsed mud brick or fill to protect this. Hellenistic occupation was just a few inches above the Lydian level, so we didn't find those layers of broken pottery that we find in other destruction contexts. So I didn't really expect very much to come of this excavation, to be honest. But of course I was wrong. Will started to find a scatter of arrowheads, something like 30 of them on this small area of burned floor, the result of an intense battle. And on the next to last day of excavation, Will phoned and told me to come out, that he'd found a little dinky piece of bone. We texted photos of it to the anthropologist who was elsewhere, who confirmed that it was human. And a bit later, Will started to find other bits of human bones, and then an iron knife. You see them examining them here, and at this point in the video, the workman noticed that there was something different in the dirt. Sadly, I turned the video off and went to look at what they found, so I missed filming Will's explosive joy and high fives with his workman when he realized that he had found 2 silver coins, these big Lydian Cresid staters. A bit more cleaning exposed 7 more smaller coins in a pocket of loose earth associated with those bones, probably in the remains of a cloth or leather bag belonging to our sad casualty. The bones, unfortunately, were burned and shattered, and remember that this area probably stood open after the destruction. It's a miracle that anything was survived at all with animals and erosion and so forth. Professor Erdal could determine that he was probably a middle-aged male, but not much more than that. The find of the coins consists of 2 staters, 4 12th staters, and 3 teeny 24th staters weighing only half a gram, found together with its owner in this historic context of the sack of Sardis in the palace of Croesus. It's a dramatic discovery, the first discovery of a group of Lydian coins since 1922, more than 100 years. It took the whole summer of 2022 for the team of conservators to remove the thick layer of corrosion from the coins, a long and painstaking process since the corrosion is different on every coin and we can't just dump them in some chemical bath and risk losing critical information. What can we learn from these coins from an excellent archaeological context? First, some scholars had doubted whether this type of coin was indeed even minted first under the Lydian kings and dated them instead to the Persian era. We had disproved this some years ago, but it's really nice to have confirmation by finding them in this second clearly datable context. These then are the earliest silver coins in the world. When were they minted? I mentioned earlier that the first bimetallic gold and silver coinage is associated with Croesus, and that Herodotus says this king ruled for only 14 years. So that would date these coins to a very short period between 561, when Croesus comes to the throne, and 547, when they're destroyed. But a recent article looks again at Herodotus' chronology and argues that his 14 years is just a made-up number, it's conventional, and points out that all the other historical evidence puts the beginning of Croesus' reign much earlier, in the 580s rather than the 560s. The wear on the coins therefore adds new evidence to this historic argument, and the conservators paid particular attention to this while cleaning the coins. Jack Kroll, who is publishing them, is working to determine whether their wear is consistent consistent with coins only 14 years old, or whether, as he believes, having spent his life looking at such coins, they must have been in circulation much longer, which would fit in very nicely with Wallace's early dating for Croesus. And so we hope that we can contribute to this discussion of this very critical date in Greek and Lydian history. And finally, it's quite rare to find these small fractions and in such a great context. Most ancient coins are studied in museum and private collections, and they're bought on the art market and don't come from scientific excavation. And collectors and museums, of course, want big, beautiful, mint condition coins, not these wretched, tiny, worn dits. The American Numismatic Society, for instance, has 61 Croesid coins in their database, but only one example of the smallest type here, the 24th stater, and only 2 of the medium ones, the 12th staters. Because of the predominance of these large coins, some scholars have argued that small change in antiquity was at this period was very rare, that the Lydians minted primarily large coins, which would have then been worth too much to use them in everyday market transactions. They could only be used for large payments like wages for mercenaries. And this idea has been losing popularity as numismatists recognize the importance of tiny fractions, but such coins are still way underrepresented in the numismatic literature. But here we have lots of small fractions together with the bodies of ordinary people, or maybe not so ordinary, we don't know who he was. And remember, we did find that tiny 24th stater with the skeleton of an ordinary soldier killed in that same battle. We found 4 casualties of battle in excavations so far, and 2 have had coins with them. It's not much of a sample, but still. Anyway, I'll be interested to see how numismatists use this find in their understanding of the origin of coinage and of the ancient economy. A short distance away from the coins was a fragment of bronze, probably hacked from a much larger object. It consists of 5 sheets, perhaps both hammered and cast. One sheet shows delicate feathers of a wing, including long, straight flight feathers and shorter covert feathers. The other sheets are riveted together, and between the functional rivets are raised circles or false decorative rivets, showing that these were ornamental and exposed. The upper edge of one sheet is scalloped with points or arrows between the curves. This has been folded over and wrecked in the destruction, obscuring the original form. The scale and the thickness of the sheet suggest that this is probably part of a monumental sculpture, the first monumental Lydian bronze sculpture ever found. It was probably broken up and partly melted in the looting of the complex, and one fragment just lost here. Its original form and location are unknown, but if it comes from nearby, it's tempting to suggest that it belongs to a bronze, winged guardian figure, like a sphinx or a griffin, maybe set up here near this entrance into the palace, like winged sphinxes and griffins, which stood on low platforms at the entrances to city and palatial complexes at Kerkenesda or other Near Eastern sites. We learned a lot about the end of the palace in 2021. In 2022, we aimed at understanding the earlier history of the palace by digging down and found at least 3 earlier phases of monumental architecture here. The Lydians were constantly tearing down and rebuilding their palace. So over those 50 years or so, we've got 3 different phases. We don't have nice finds as we do from the destruction level, but it does give us a sense of the long history of the place. We'll return there this summer, I hope, but and we expect to find earlier stuff still, which we found elsewhere. The north side, and we'll have to look there for a moment. The north side of the hill was terraced with a wall of huge boulders, not the finely cut limestone masonry, but something looking much earlier and rougher, more than 45 meters long, and the most conspicuous monument of Lydian architecture on the city site. Guzine Eren of Boston University has bravely dug on this steep and windy slope for 10 seasons, and just last summer finished her PhD thesis on these terraces. Here she is, dating that monumental wall to the 8th century BC. And this transformation of the natural landscape through terracing therefore goes back to the 8th century before the time of Gyges, when the Greeks were living in small villages. On top of the terrace, she found nothing really remaining of the 6th and 7th centuries BC, thanks to all that looting. But in deep excavations, she found a big mud brick building with gaps for massive wooden posts associated with pottery that was very plain and hard to date, but clearly quite early. In 2019, she located the corner of this building and could reconstruct it as a square about 16 by 16 feet and continuing around to the south and east. You can see how the 8th century wall at the top there has cut through the mud brick building, so it must be earlier. Its thick walls and substantial post holes suggest a tall and monumental structure, not just an ordinary house. We haven't been able to dig more of this recently, but new carbon-14 dates do confirm what the pottery suggests, that it's built in the 9th century BC and destroyed in the late 9th or early 8th century. So both of these monumental phases then belong to that mythological period of Sardis's history. They're in fact our earliest examples of monumental architecture at the site, dating to the proto-historic mythological period well before Greek settlements were urbanized. And I want to emphasize that our historical records for early Sardis come entirely from outside sources, right? From the Assyrians, who had no contact with the Lydians until the 7th century, and from the Greeks, who weren't even writing all that much before the 7th century. So we've sort of understood the sudden appearance of the Lydians in the historical record as the result of a quick rise to power of the Mermad dynasty, after Gyges, and assume that since we don't hear much about them before then, the Lydians can't have been all that significant. Just a bunch of crazy stories about Heracles and Omphale or somebody. But absence of evidence, of course, is not evidence of absence, and the archaeology shows us that the Lydians were building monumental structures, terracing their city, and holding feasts for more than 100 people in this region as early as the 9th or early 8th centuries BC. We found even more unexpected evidence for early monumental architecture in that central trench. Remember that Strabo says that Sardis was founded only after the Trojan War, 1200 or so BC. We dug a series of 2 deep sondages into the terrace to learn more about the artificial terracing of this hill. Digging through Wilbrus dug through something like 5 meters of sand and gravel, which raised the level in the 6th century, time of Alyattes or so, as you see there. Underneath that, though, in a tiny sondage, he found occupation levels of 1,000 years earlier in the Bronze Age, with these unusual nosed pots and other shapes of the 2nd millennium BC. He got about 1 meter of occupation debris here, and then found beneath that was another 4 or 5 meters of sterile gravel. That is Lydian terracefill, or terracefill rather. He'd found an earlier terrace showing this hill was already terraced in the Bronze Age. And eventually, 14 meters below surface, the height of a 5-story building, he reached bedrock, sloping down steeply to the west, so steep that it couldn't have been inhabited without monumental terracing. Pottery from this sondage dates to the early Bronze Age, about 2000 or a little earlier, and new carbon-14 dates confirmed this, that it goes back to 2200 or thereabouts. We're now forced to abandon Strabo's claim that Sardis was founded only after the Trojan War, about 1200 BC. We have occupation here 1,000 years earlier, and not just occupation, but monumental terracing. That deep terrace fill implies that just as the Lydians were reshaping their landscape through monumental terracing, so did their Bronze Age predecessors. And just as the Sardians in the Roman period lived in an ancient landscape and could point to great monuments of their ancestors, the Lydians too inherited an already built environment. In order to expand these excavations into early Lydian Sardis, we started excavation a few years ago on a lower terrace on the western side of the hill. Geophysical survey had revealed a very deep anomaly, more than 3 meters deep, huge walls, which we hoped reflected something early, Lydian or maybe even earlier. We started excavation in 2018, and in 2019 we were excavating what seemed to be earthquake debris, meters of dense and partly articulated masonry fall that covered buildings that looked very late Roman. And we thought we had that 7th century earthquake again. But we kept finding these later bits of pottery, and it wasn't easy to tell whether those sherds were intrusive, stuff that sort of slipped through the earthquake debris, which happens, or whether we were really dealing with something much later. And last summer, we finally got the definitive answer. The buildings may be late Roman in their original construction, but they survived that 7th century earthquake and continued to be occupied for centuries. They're filled with Byzantine graves. We left about 19 of them unopened for the anthropologists this summer, and lots more Byzantine pottery, Byzantine coins, and a rather nice Byzantine processional cross. The carbon-14 dates suggest about 1014 and 1040. 2 coins are the same date, and the pottery may be as late as the 15th or 16th century, so we've got many centuries of use. We're not sure yet what kind of building this was, with every room filled with graves. And with that fine processional cross, is it something religious, something secular? We're not sure. And it is the first time that we found occupation this late in central Sardis. As I mentioned, everybody else moves up to the Acropolis, so we don't know what we're looking for here, or what we're looking at here. But it's sort of typical that this one trench has produced 4,000 years of Sardis's history, from the earliest known occupation in the early Bronze Age to the latest occupation only a few meters away and 4,000 years later, and both of them completely unexpected. We learn a lot from excavation. We're also interested in the region around Sardis, and last summer we started a new survey project of the Lydian cemeteries around the city. Lydian Sardis was unusual in having cemeteries scattered for many kilometers to the south and west of the ancient city, often chamber tombs dug into the living rock. About 1,000 of these were dug by Howard Crosby Butler between 1910 and 1914, but his maps and records have been mostly lost, unfortunately. So Susanna Ebbinghaus and Annetta Alexandridis of Cornell led students Leila Urer and Okan Emre Güney on a daunting task of walking the steep hills around the site. These paths show just a few days' travel in late June and July when they walked many kilometers, and they eventually recorded more than 300 tombs with high-precision GPS coordinates, photographs, and occasionally with 3D models, giving us for the first time a broad view of the extensive cemeteries of Sardis. These chamber tombs carved into the soft bedrock formed underground rooms and almost houses, with each room often containing multiple couches to lay out the dead, and they were used for many generations, probably from the early Lydian period into the Hellenistic. The Lydians equipped their dead with everything they would need to feast in the afterlife, with gold and silver jewelry, seals, and other treasures, much of which is, or some of which is in the Metropolitan on display now. During their excavation of these tombs, the Butler expedition found thousands of these wonderful artifacts, some of the most beautiful objects, in my opinion, ever found at the site. But the upheavals of World War I and then Butler's unexpected death in 1922 left them mostly unpublished. So one of the members of the Butler expedition, George Henry Chase, was given the task of publishing the pottery from these tombs. Chase then joined Harvard University as a professor of archaeology in 1916, but he became involved in other excavations, and so in 1938, he bequeathed the Sardis material to a newly arrived young instructor, not even an assistant professor, but a refugee from Germany named George Hanfmann. Hanfmann worked on this material for years, but he became convinced that he needed, quote, at least one short campaign on the site, a short summer campaign of small scope. Hanfmann went on to direct, as I said, 18 seasons at the site, Greeny another 32 years, and Chase's pottery remains unpublished. So this survey is part of a project to study and publish that material, and so fulfill the obligations of generations of American archaeologists who have worked at the site over the last century. And it's a really exciting project in itself, and the subject, as I say, of another lecture. Let me talk briefly about some of our site conservation projects in recent years. In 2018, we finished the 5-year project to clean the Temple of Artemis of a century of biogrowth using a technique developed by Michael Morris, whom you see at the left. This has been one of the most satisfying undertakings we've accomplished, returning the temple to its former rich glow. We've also been working on the synagogue. This is at the western portion of the city where Professor Hanfmann began excavation at Sardis 66 years ago. Hanfmann excavated and then restored an enormous bath gymnasium complex with a great colonnaded marble court along a colonnaded avenue. In the corner of the bath gymnasium, he discovered a synagogue, or a building which proved to be a synagogue, the largest in the ancient world. The synagogue was discovered in 1963, and it quickly became clear that this was a spectacular building, The entire floor was paved with carpet-like geometric mosaics, and the walls revetted with colored marbles. A number of menorahs were found in the building, and inscriptions recording the dedication of bays of mosaics, panels of wall revetment, and other parts of the synagogue. The synagogue was discovered by David Gordon Mitten when he was a young graduate student of Professor Hanfmann's. David worked at Sardis since 1959, went on to teach at Harvard for 43 years, but stayed deeply involved in Sardis throughout his life. He passed away in January 2022, but until the end, he could recount the names and life histories of every workman who worked for him his entire career. He's deeply missed by us and by his colleagues at Harvard and by the people of Sart. Anyway, a real problem, though, was what to do with this amazing building and its 1,400 square meters of mosaics. You couldn't pick them up and move them to the local museum in Manisa since the Sardis synagogue was larger than that museum. They would disintegrate if you left them exposed to the weather. Hanfmann could have reburied the mosaics, but that seems a shame. It must have been quite the white elephant. So they decided to undertake a monumental restoration program, one of the great achievements of his years as director. They brought in the legendary conservator from Larry Majewski from New York University to oversee the work, and he trained a team of workmen. They took aerial photographs and made records of the mosaic using high-tech aerial method for aerial photos at the time, the Whittlesea bipod, sort of the ancestor of our drones. They then lifted the mosaics from the floor by gluing cloth over them and then rolling them up, separating the mosaic tessera, the stone tiles, from their mortar backing. This left them with a layer of stone cubes glued to cloth. They then set those tesserae in new reinforced concrete panels. They laid a concrete bedding over the whole synagogue and replaced the panels in their original locations on that concrete bedding. I should emphasize that this is not what conservators would recommend today, but 50 years ago, conservation practices were different. They reconstructed the walls and shrines and other elements from a combination of ancient and modern materials, re-erected the columns of the forecourt, made concrete casts of the furnishings, and when the project was completed in 1973, it was an extraordinary achievement, one of the very few ancient buildings that give you an idea of the original space and decoration and furnishings, and where you could safely walk on the original pavements laid in modern concrete. However, these mosaics were not meant to be left exposed to the rain and weather. And over the past 50 years, despite the best efforts of reinforced concrete, the mosaics have begun to deteriorate. Water enters through tiny cracks, causing the iron rebar inside to rust and expand, which widens the cracks and causes further incursion. In 2008, Kent Severson worked on places where the mosaics had cracked and reported that the rebar was still in okay shape, but was deteriorating and would continue to do so until the mosaics of the whole building had failed, and then we'd have to relift and reset them, a truly awful prospect. The only way to avoid inevitable destruction was to keep the weather out, and it was better to do so before the panels failed. So since 2008, a team of conservators and architects and engineers and archaeologists has met at Sardis and in the US to design a shelter to protect the building. They designed a lightweight roof with a steel frame and curving trusses 22 meters long. On different levels, this sort of dancing roof, as architect Troy Thompson describes it, has alternating higher and lower sections to break the monotony and to ensure good airflow. They investigated different designs and materials, but in the end settled on a sturdy and translucent fabric which provides excellent protection, is light and long-lasting, safe in earthquakes, and not prohibitively expensive. It took 10 years to design the roof, a couple more to get permission to construct it. In 2019, a very generous gift from Patrick Healy of Hellman and Freeman, facilitated by long-term Sardis supporter Osman Mardin, provided the financial backing for the project, and we were all set to begin building in the next summer, but then, of course, 2020 happened. The pandemic was only a temporary setback, though, and in 2021, we started construction. An ugly concrete beam on top of the reconstructed walls supports the roof, but it was carefully covered by a skin of masonry which matches the original material so that you never know that it exists. The curving steel trusses were assembled on the ground and lifted into place with an 80-ton crane. They stretched the tenting material over the trusses, added bird netting and downspouts and gutters and all the trimmings, and the roof was finally finished in November 2021. After more than a decade of work, it was incredibly satisfying last summer for the architects and conservators to finally see it in person, and especially to hear the space. And it's really surprising how it's changed the building. It's now a building, not a ruin, with an acoustic presence and a gentle light not exposed to the glaring sun. The roof not only protects the mosaics, but provides welcome shelter from the heat of the day. And those of you who have visited Sardis may remember the synagogue as an incandescent oven. And now it's cool and breezy and a refuge for the hot and weary. We even got to crash test it during a torrential rainstorm last summer, which happens increasingly frequently as the climate changes, and the roof performed admirably. While we were building the roof, the same team of women who had cleaned the temple so successfully used that same technique to remove half a century of crust from the mosaics. This completely transformed them. In the upper right, you can see how the white tesserae had turned completely black with cyanobacteria, and after even partial cleaning, they're returned to their original brilliant colors. The soft light and gentle cleaning has brought out the lively colors of the mosaics, and the roof allows people to stay here and really look at them rather than fleeing the intense heat. Unfortunately, this means that they can take a leisurely look at the somewhat coarse restoration of the 1960s. On the right, you see how the concrete has leaked through holes in the original mosaics, and even small missing areas and bright white cement break up the geometric patterns. In the 60s, those fills were needed to keep the mosaics from deteriorating, but now with the building protected by the roof, conservators Michael Morris and Hiroko Kariya have started a new project to restore the mosaics. They don't want to restore all the missing areas, obviously. You can see that would be more restoration than original. But to cut out some of the smaller areas of modern cement fills and replace them with new tesserae to draw the patterns together. They trained a crew of local women in the ancient art of mosaic laying, how to cut the stones to shape and match the original patterns. They started simple with a black and white and simple design and will work up to complicated patterns. And it's very satisfying, again, to see the women of villages around Sardis continuing to contribute to their ancient site and taking justifiable pride in their work. In addition, it attracts the attention of visitors to the synagogue, and this has become a kind of laboratory where visitors can watch the process and ask questions of the team. The women are glad and proud to explain, and it's really much more engaging than just visiting some old ruin. With its new roof, the synagogue has become a really pleasant and interesting place to visit. In July, for instance, an elite Istanbul clothing company held its fashion shoot for its winter catalog there with the permission of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. And I particularly loved the contrast between the fashions of Istanbul and the colorful village fashions of our local staff. Anyway, the women can continue to work until the end of October, and we hope to have teams of women working maybe 6 to 8 months a year for maybe another 5 or 10 years. A long, slow, but satisfying project. Meanwhile, the final publication of the synagogue by Andy Seeger is nearing completion. It's fun to talk about field work and so forth, but the real work and the most important results of the expedition are these final reports. And I want to especially call out editor Kerry Sullivan, who oversees these and has brought out 3 major reports in the past 4 years, which is not so bad. The synagogue is also the last legacy volume from Professor Hanfmann's years as field director, and we are proud to be bringing that phase of publication to a close. And now we can turn to publication of our more recent work, such as the monumental arch outside the synagogue. This, as I said, was an unexpected discovery. The team had actually discovered a few of the fallen blocks of this building in the 1970s, but not realized that they belonged to the largest arch in the Roman world, with a central span of more than 13 meters. I'll be winding up this lecture now, so I won't go into the details of this, but just mention that we found this big pile of rocks. But I won't let that's done, and and we're now turning mostly to the publication phase. But I've been stubbornly forbidding the team, led by Ursula Quatember and Andy Leung and John Sigmeyer, from lifting those blocks because they're such a great document of the earthquake and collapse. So John Sigmeyer last summer took 17,000 photographs to make a super high resolution 3D model using photogrammetry, accurate to less than a millimeter, and this allows him to make precise drawings and studies of the blocks. Let me just return to roofing briefly. Across the street from the synagogue and arch is the Lydian fortification, whose discovery 40 years ago completely changed our understanding of Sardis. This has been under an ugly, temporary roof ever since, and nobody, not even members of the expedition, can see this most impressive monument of the period of Alyattes and Croesus. That roof was never meant as a long-term solution, and we've watched it sort of slowly be damaged by humidity and rising damp. In the 1990s, we even decided that it was hopeless, and we planned to rebury it. But conservator Michael Morris again came up with this plan to protect this as well, and the architects have designed a program of coordinated roofs over the synagogue and the Lydian fortification using the same architectural vocabulary. The synagogue was the easy one, and in building that we figured out a lot of the problems that will face us across the street. And we were working on that last summer, where to put the footings and so forth. The final plans were submitted last winter, and just today, the curule that gives permission visited the site, and we hope any day now to get permission to build so that we can start construction even before the summer season begins. That project is made possible by a generous bequest from William Collins Kohler, who was one of Professor Hanfmann's star students and worked at the site in the late 50s and early 60s. Once the roof is built, we've got lots of jobs, big jobs ahead, including building an encapsulation that will protect the mud brick while resembling the original face. So we're preparing now for a busy season of construction, of excavation, researching earthquakes and the end of antiquity, site conservation, research and publication, and also a number of brand new sectors and projects, which I'm very excited about, but we'll wrap this up now. A final and welcome development is that the Ministry of Culture in Ankara is preparing its application to UNESCO to nominate Sardis for World Heritage status. This has been on the tentative list for 10 years or so, and we hope to submit it for permanent inscription this fall. When it comes off, it will have a big effect on the number of visitors to the site, making site conservation and roofing programs even more important. Sardis then never fails to impress and excite and utterly confuse me. From the unexpected discovery of an extra 1,000 or so years of prehistory to the unknown earthquake that brought an end to urban life in the early Byzantine period, from the lost beauty of the mosaics in the synagogue hiding under a coating of biofilm and baking heat, to the monumental structures, to tiny coins weighing less than 1/10 of a gram, the site has this diversity almost unlike any other. It's a great privilege to work there, thanks to the ongoing support of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, and particularly to work with such a talented team of professionals, students, scholars, and experts, some of whom are here tonight. And I want to thank all of them, and especially thanks to you for your patience. Thank you. And I should mention, we have a newsletter. I forgot to bring them, but they are available online. You can just, if you go to sardisexpedition.org, it's not the restaurant and it's not the church in Mississippi. And you go there and you can get newsletters and all of our publications and all that junk.
I want to tell you that I have copies of the newsletter.
Oh, good.
Also,
Oh.
not with me, but they're fabulous. And I didn't know I had to bring it so you could all see.
I just forgot, sorry.
In any case, well, you forgot practically nothing. This was absolutely fascinating, and I tell the audience, in another 5 years, you're coming back.
Okay.
Because we want to know what's happened since. It's an amazing site, and clearly it will be a UNESCO inscribed site. There's no choice about it.
Inshallah.
No fingers, inshallah, as well. And if there's anything that we can do, you let us know.
Thank you.
This lecture, incidentally, will be on the club's website in around 3 weeks. We really don't have time for questions, but let me take one question. First hand I see. No one is. No one. We're so glad that we heard you speak. Is there one hand for question? Yes, please.
Okay. Can people participate in the dig? That's right.
We have a small camp and lots of specialists involved, and we do entertain applications. Most of the I can't offer. It's one problem is that in Israel and Cyprus and so forth, people can come and volunteer and just to wield shovels and stuff, which is how I learned. And it's great, but we don't do that. We hire local workmen and women for this, so we don't have that range of foreign participants, unfortunately. But for specialists who do things, we do sometimes take people.
I want to say that we had a program, and unfortunately a wonderful speaker from Greece, where he came here. When he went back, it was right at the beginning of COVID, and he had to isolate for 2 weeks away from his family. But he spoke about how they are really educating the local community to work at the sites, but also the local community has a lot of knowledge that they pass on as well. I want to mention our remaining programs from this series. We have April 20th with Doug Tilden on A Tale of Two Pyramids, May 10th with Jane Hickman on In Search of Lost Time, Gold Jewelry in Minoan, Crete, June 22nd, long postponed, International Archaeology Day with His Excellency Mr. Evangelos Sakarias, the Ambassador of Greece to the United Nations. And since you've mentioned Cyprus, advance notice that October 2nd, we're the Consul General from Cyprus coming for International Archaeology Day. If you'd like to be on our committee email list, Courtney, see beautiful blonde Courtney Brown in back and give her your email card and information, and you will be on Archaeology Addicts to be invited to our programs at the club. I thank you all for your attention, and everyone was a rapt audience because it was such an extraordinary program. I thank you. A brief reception because we have dinner with our well-deserved speaker to relax. So thank you.